Hello, everyone. I am going to give you a quick input about last week's general election in Israel, which occurred last Tuesday, September 17th. This was actually the second general election that we've had in the last number of months. We had an election in April that it appeared that Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of the Likud party, had won, but he was then unable to forge a coalition and immediately dispersed the parliament when he wasn't able to form a coalition, and called for new elections, which occurred Tuesday, September 17th. And this election, the second election, produced a little bit of a different result than the first one. We can say for sure that the one loser of this election is Benjamin Netanyahu, because he didn't succeed in achieving what he set out to achieve. He set out to achieve a government, a coalition that would be based exclusively on his Likud party with the ultra-Orthodox and further right-wing parties. And that goal was not achieved. He didn't get the minimum of 61 seats, 61 out of 120 Knesset seats or parliament seats that he would need to form that coalition. And he was hoping to have that coalition in part in order to be able to pass a law which would grant him immunity from facing the law. He has a pre-indictment trial coming up in 2 weeks for a few different charges that he is apparently going to have to face now, because he will not be able to form a coalition that would be supportive of such a law. So Netanyahu did seem to lose this election, but it's not really clear who won the election. The chief rival party, which is the Blue and White Party, achieved more seats than Netanyahu's Likud party. The Blue and White Party, who's led by the former chief of staff of the Israeli army, Benny Gantz, they received 33 seats in the Knesset, whereas Likud achieved 31 seats. However, neither party really has a clear path to be able to form a coalition. Netanyahu, immediately after the election, I believe one day after the election, immediately gathered what he calls his natural partners in for a meeting, which is the ultra-Orthodox parties and the further right-wing party, the Jewish Settler Party, which is now called Yamina, or rightward. He gathered them into a meeting and signed them that they would all operate as a bloc. And basically the idea being that Netanyahu would try to negotiate on all of their behalf with possibly centrist or left-wing parties, smaller parties, that he would be able to bring them into a coalition along with them. They together forging a 55-seat grouping, again, short of that magic number of 61. But this, it's not completely clear what Netanyahu's strategy here is, because the centrist party, Benny Gantz, the Blue and White Party, has stated that he would not sit in this kind of government. And he may try to entice certain members of that party to leave that party and join with this bloc with various offers of certain portfolios in the government. It doesn't seem that that's going to work, though. Gantz, on the other hand, has set his own terms. He does also not have the numbers to form a government, a coalition with the smaller left-wing parties. And it seems that the only possibility is going to be some kind of national unity government. But this also has its own problems, because Netanyahu is not going to easily give up being prime minister. He's been prime minister of Israel now for over 10 years. And also, if he is indicted, which looks like he very well may be in the next probably 2 months or so, an indictment does not force a prime minister to leave his post. However, if Netanyahu was a minister in a unity government, not prime minister, say he was defense minister or foreign minister, Israeli law dictates that he would have to leave that post and leave government activity while sitting trial. So it's a very weird law that actually a prime minister can be under trial, but a foreign minister or defense minister cannot. So Netanyahu is going to be very hesitant to give up being prime minister under a unity government with Gantz. But on the other hand, Benny Gantz said over and over as a campaign pledge that he would not sit in a government that was led by Netanyahu as prime minister, basically as an anti-corruption stance. The fact that Netanyahu is going to be facing indictment means that Gantz would not sit in a government under a prime minister who is facing indictment, or soon in the next couple of months probably will actually be indicted. So it's kind of a game of chicken, right? A game of politicians playing chicken of who's going to blink first. Neither one of them wants to be blamed for forcing on the Israeli public a third round of elections, which would be terribly unpopular among the Israeli public and a huge waste of money. But on the other hand, neither one wants to, let's say, blink first in letting the other one sit as prime minister first in a rotation agreement under a unity coalition. Now, Gantz can probably justify to his voters sitting with Netanyahu in a government as long as Gantz himself is first in this rotation as prime minister, meaning that Gantz would be prime minister for 2 years and then Netanyahu would be prime minister for 2 years. And the reason that Gantz could justify this is because if Netanyahu were to be indicted and the trial would take place, that trial would end and Netanyahu would likely either have a plea agreement or be sitting in prison or be found innocent, be found not guilty within that 2-year period. So the issue would become a non-issue, and Gantz would then, according to his thinking, be prime minister for 2 years and then have to hand the reins over to another candidate from the Likud party, probably not Netanyahu, who would be forced to leave political life at that time. So it's a very complicated situation. I imagine that around the world, people are scratching their heads saying, well, who won the election? Well, it's really not clear. It seems that there's going to have to be some kind of a unity government with a rotation agreement. Neither one wants to blink first, though. I mean, I really think that if Gantz blinks first and allows Netanyahu to serve as prime minister for, 2 years, he would lose a lot of credibility with his voting public, and it would really portray him as being weak and someone who flip-flops on his most significant campaign promise. Now, a couple of important takeaways from this election, no matter who ends up forming the government in the end. One thing to point out is that this election was very much not an election on any issue. It wasn't really an election about the Palestinian issue, about the broader Israeli-Arab conflict. It wasn't that much of an election about socio-economic issues. It was very much an election that was a referendum on Netanyahu as a person and the direction that he is taking the country in. And I would say that in general, the public has spoken in the sense that even though Likud did reach 31 seats, it's quite a bit less than they did in April. And in a way, the public has spoken in the sense that it's saying no to the direction that Netanyahu was taking the public discourse, in the sense that Netanyahu was very divisive, portraying the justice system, the police, the media, various other democratic institutions as in some ways enemies of the state. And I believe that the public has said no to this kind of extremist rhetoric. And you can see that in the way the voting distributed among the various parties, the centrist parties. We can say Likud is maybe somewhat of a right-center party, got a significant amount of votes, but even more so the centrist blue and white party, center-left, let's say blue and white party, received a large amount of votes, whereas the smaller rightist parties and the smaller leftist parties received a smaller amount of votes. So in a way, this election was an illustration that the public is to a large extent centrist and rejecting more extremist approaches both on the right and the left wing. Another important issue is that the Arab public came out to vote much more in this election than the previous one. The now joint, it's called the Joint Arab List Party, which is actually a conglomeration of 4 different Arab parties, had quite an achievement in this election, has shown that they're a significant political force that they weren't in previous elections. Also, this party, aside from 3 members of the party, 3 Knesset members who did not agree to this, recommended actively for Gantz to be prime minister, which the Arab parties have not done over the last number of years. Since the time of Yitzhak Rabin in the early 1990s, the Arab parties have not recommended any candidate to be prime minister, which means it's a signal that says they want to take an active role in political life more so than in the past. One thing to point out right now, today's Tuesday. I'm speaking to you on Tuesday, September 24th. So by the time you see this, it will be at least September 25th, which means that the president is a symbolic position in Israel, but it's more than a symbolic position because the president will make his decision, will announce his decision tomorrow on September 25th of who he is given the first try to form a government, right? Over the last 3 days, the president has had consultations with the leaders of the various parties and asked each of them who do they recommend to be prime minister, right? I mentioned just a few minutes ago that the Arab Party, the Joint Arab List, recommended Gantz, whereas the centrist and left-wing parties also recommended Gantz, and the right-wing and ultra-Orthodox parties recommended Netanyahu. There's one party who's kind of the kingmaker of this election, which is Avigdor Lieberman's party called Yisrael Beitenu, which is a Russian immigrant party, who has basically said they're not recommending either candidate as prime minister. They will only support a unity government that would exclude the ultra-Orthodox parties. So a kind of a secular unity government. That's what the Yisrael Beitenu, led by Avigdor Lieberman, would recommend. So it's a very, very complex political picture where various parties seem to boycott sitting in a coalition with other parties, and it's a situation of trying to have to square the circle. In my mind, the only solution is a unity government. I'm not the only one who has this view. This is what many analysts have stated, and it seems that it's the only way that it can work out mathematically. However, the question is who's going to flinch first on the issue of who will be prime minister first in a rotation agreement is kind of the key issue that no one really knows how that's going to work out. Netanyahu is in some ways fighting for his life here, right? I mean, he's not going to, his political life will be over, it seems soon, pending these indictments. So he's not just fighting for his political life, he's in a way fighting for his chance to stay out of prison. And there's a chance that he will at some point reach a plea agreement, but he may just go down fighting until the bitter end and actually stand trial. So the legal issues and the political issues are quite interconnected here. And unfortunately, I don't have a very solid idea of where this is going to all lead. It really is a question of who's the more wily negotiator and who's going to blink first. And I assume it may take more than a month or two until we have final solutions to these. But I would say by November or at the latest December, we would have to have an idea of who our next prime minister will be and what the government will look like. So I hope I've been able to, in some ways, make some semblance of order in this mess, because that's what it really is. And one takeaway that we should take, I mean, this has been stated many times over the last number of years, but I'll state it again. The results of this election, the kind of tie of this election, illustrates that our representative election system which is always based on coalition forming, is broken. And we need to maybe think about a different electoral system, possibly a regional system, or maybe a presidential system, because the issue in which there has never, since Israel's establishment, been one party that's been able to form a government alone, been able to reach that threshold of 61 seats alone without forming a coalition, the fact that that's never happened, and that the large parties are always being in some ways played by the smaller parties who can threaten to form or leave a coalition if their needs are not taken care of, becomes a real problem for government stability, and it's not very good for democracy. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts for now, and I assume that in the next number of weeks or months you'll have more of an idea of where this is all leading. Things change quite quickly here, so it's possible that by the time you're watching this, some of the things I'm saying are not totally relevant, but this is the best analysis I can give from the vantage point of September 24th, 2019. Thank you for listening.